Welcome to the Boomer Briefing Podcast, where we help you solve a critical business issue in 20 minutes or less. I'm your host, Jon Hubbard, consultant and shareholder here at Boomer Consulting. And with me today is Sandra Wiley. Hi, Sandra. Thank you for being on this episode of the podcast.
Thanks, John, and welcome, audience. I'm glad you're here.
And we have a fun conversation today, but before we dive into that, most of you know Sandra, but Sandra is president and shareholder here at Boomer Consulting as well, and works with firms in all sorts of areas, but is very focused on talent, culture, leadership, and how all that blends together. So we have a topic for Sandra today that I think is perfectly suited for her, and that is essential measurements of firm culture. I think if you talk to any firm leader out there, they will talk about culture being important, but also culture can be really hard to define and measure. So we're going to speak about that today. So Sandra, my first question to you is, why is it important for firms, and firm leadership to be concerned and focused on culture and how to measure it?
Well, I love this topic. And I have been involved in helping firms with culture building and research culture for years. And what's really funny is a lot of firms say, well, you can't really define culture. It just is what it is. And you really don't know what culture is. And it really never changes. Your culture is kind of who you are. So first thing I would tell you is that some of that is true. It is who you are. It's the way your firm employees will describe who you are as a culture, but it does change. And it changes with a lot of different people involved, and it changes with attributes from outside that are coming in and creating issues for us, right? So culture does change. The other thing that I think has changed a ton, and I believe your firm is probably morphing in this direction and you may not even realize it, but we've always looked at results cultures, like what creates the results that we want to do the things we want to do in our firm. Today, I think we're going to more of a growth culture instead of a results culture, because results are all about hours, right? How many hours did you work, etc. Growth is about how are we doing the right things to get what we want. And I think there are things within that we can really measure and that we can really that will help make our culture better going forward. So does that make sense, John?
It does. That makes perfect sense. So as firms think about measurements as it relates to firm culture, what are some examples of those measurements?
So it is so interesting that we have, if you go back and look at people like Peter Drucker, they're always talking about you get what you measure, right? And what we try to do is that's the reason hours are such a big deal for us, what we think is a big deal, because that's easy to measure. But when you think about culture, what really creates a measurement and what really creates whether we're doing a good job or not is how people feel. And that, accountants hate to hear that word feeling, because that means you have to go into a different part of your brain to think about it. But I would tell you the first thing that you have to measure is leadership. Do you have appropriate leaders in place? And are they helping to really set the tone for the culture you want? If you want a culture that says we're a learning culture, are your leaders learning? We want a growth culture. Are you measuring growth? We want a culture that is a ton of communication. Are they communicating? So that all goes back to pulse surveys or upward evaluations, right? So if you're going to measure leadership, figure out what you're trying to measure in those leaders, and then do an upward evaluation from employees within the company, and also pulse surveys where you do a one question every month and just see how it's going. You will, as long as you do them so that they are anonymous, so people can't tell who said what, you will get great feedback. And I think leadership is the first thing. The second thing I think that we really have to measure these days is communication. And again, you can do that through pulse surveys, you can do that through upward evaluations, but are we really communicating well? Are we giving them the transparency that they want? And when I say they, it's your team members and what they think and what they want. And I wish I could tell you, here's the formula for every good firm. That's not true. because every firm has a little bit of something that's different about them. And it usually does come from leadership, but communication is always at the top of our list. John, when you and I talk about, when we talk to our talent circle, or when we talk to any of our firms and we say, let's do a survey and see what people like and what they don't like, communication always comes out as number 1 or 2 on the things they wish was better, always. And so, and by the way, if you work on it a little bit, you're going to have to work on it more next year. Every year, there's something else that people would want to have better in communication. The one that has bubbled to the top that I think has been really interesting to watch this year is the measurement on how people feel their wellness is. So mental and physical wellness. And is there a way for us to identify and really help people through very trying times? And that has been something that truly we have seen probably bubble to the top because of COVID and because of what's happened in the last, year and a half that we've been going through all of this. But I don't think that's going away. That's just because we all get a vaccine, or some people get a vaccine, does not mean that wellness and the feeling of wanting to be taken care of and feel like you are being heard about how you feel the wellness side of the world is going, that's not going away. We have got to make sure that we are measuring that. And again, that goes back to surveys with your employees and making sure that they understand. And then I think, and I'll say this is about environment, right? How do we handle change, and how well do we handle, and how fast do we handle change? And that goes back to, some people call it change management. I don't. I call it change leadership. If you are leading through change, if you are telling people this is okay, we don't have all the answers yet, but we will make sure we are there for you, and we will adapt, and we will be flexible. I think that's another big cultural piece that you have got to be a part of. And then the last one I'll talk about is innovation. If you are a firm that is still trying to do the same things you did 10, 15, 20 years ago, and you're trying to do them still to this day, you are losing out on a culture that will keep people. People need to see that you are changing with the times, whether that is having diversity and inclusion initiatives in your firm, whether that is how you're billing so that you're going to more fixed fees and more having a more service line where you're looking at how you're offering your services, and then how you're billing for those services, and how you're looking at hours. I mean, it's all of that, right? If that is not starting to shift and change, you're behind the times. And if you're behind the times, you will lose your people, and you're going to lose them either to other firms or just to themselves. I've seen more startups happen in the last, 5 years than I've ever seen in this profession. So be mindful of that. So I think if you're looking at and you're really building a culture around all of those things I just talked about, you will be in good shape going forward. You will have a firm of the future that you'll be proud of. If you're sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, I think I'm going to turn off this podcast now because this is all a bunch of hooey, then don't be surprised if nobody wants to buy your firm in 2 or 3 years and nobody's still working there. So I think it's that critical that you start changing.
Those are great, Sandra. And again, we could spend all day on all of those, I would imagine. But one word you said, among all that is transparency. And I think that's what, at least I'm seeing when I'm working with firms. People want to work for leadership that is transparent, not a leadership team that knows every answer to every hard question or knows exactly what to do in every situation, but a leadership group that is transparent and willing to ask questions from their team, know that they're going to get a diversity of answers back.
Yeah.
And they have to tease through that and come up with a strategy and communicate with their team throughout that entire process. Are you seeing that real need for transparency as being maybe one of the most important things among all of this?
Yeah. And I think it's, there are 2 T words that are important here, right? Transparency is one of them. And John, you and I both, as shareholders in our company, we see that all the time. People don't care if you say to them, I don't know. I'm really not sure how that's going to happen. As long as you're being honest and transparent with them. I think the other piece of it is transparency breeds trust among your team. And I think that's huge. If your culture has really worked hard to build trust with your team members, it starts with shareholders and then going down to team members, and you're able to say, you know, I just trust what they're telling me. I trust that we're going in the right direction. I trust the people that I'm working with. That will show you that you have a strong, transparent culture that will really protect you and your team. But I'm telling you, there's a great tool out there. It's a trust factor quotient that you can get, and you can take this test, and you can have all your team members take the test. But basically, what it's looking for: do you trust the people that you work with? I mean, do you really trust that what they tell you is the truth? Do you trust that they're taking you in a direction that you have protected the firm? Do you trust that what they're doing will set you up so that you'll have a career and a firm to work for in the next 20 years? If you have a high trust quotient, right, I think you'll be fine. But that's a big part of culture. And you and I can see the ones that are broken when we go talk to people, because the trust factor is low. You hear things like, I know they had you come in to do this strategic plan, or I know they had you come in to do this growth plan, or whatever it is. But honestly, they're not going to do anything with it. They do this all the time. They have people come in, they figure out what we need to do, and then nothing ever happens. Trust is low in those organizations. Those that say, oh my gosh, this is the third year you're back, and oh my gosh, this is great. We have all these initiatives going and we feel good about the firm and we're all a part of it. Trust is high. And that means transparency is high. So I agree with you.
I love that you added trust to that, because, you know, especially over the last year, I think there's been lots of times, partner groups and firms, it can feel a little lonely based off all the decisions, like monumental decisions they're having to make. And I was speaking with one partner the other day, and they said, you know, our staff just doesn't know what it's like to make these types of decisions. They don't understand how complex it is. And one of my comments back to him was, well, I think there's an opportunity for you to be more transparent about this so they do understand and learn. That's all, you know. And so the more transparent you are, the more they start to understand what it's like to be you in making those decisions and the factors that you're considering, which breeds trust and, you know, increases trust. So I just love that you added that, Sandra. All right.
Good.
So how is this topic relevant to outside the profession? You touched on some ways firms are doing this, you know, and we always like to ask in this podcast, what's going on outside the profession with regards to measurements and firm culture? What are you seeing out there, Sandra?
You know, it's very interesting. I think everyone in the world right now is dealing with something very similar, because there's a lot of things that are converging all at one time, right? There's the COVID thing that hit everybody. I don't care what profession you're in, what industry you're in, that's hitting everybody. I think that the other thing that's hitting everyone right now is a lot of baby boomers that are getting ready to exit the workforce. And we have a lot of young leaders that are popping up to the top, and they're the ones that are going to develop that culture going forward. So I don't think that's, that's not CPA centric, right? I think that you could take culture and you can go into any business. Okay, so take my favorite place to go eat. I don't like fast food too much, but I love Chick-fil-A. And I only talk about them because of their culture. If you go to most Chick-fil-A's, and I go to them all over the United States, the people are friendly. They feel valued. People feel valued. They feel like they're having fun. They feel like they're getting the information they need to do their job well and to help clients well. That culture, that is transparency. That is trust. That is good leadership. And I was telling somebody the other day that in our community of Manhattan, Kansas, our Chick-fil-A manager came and helped the people that were doing the vaccine process because their process was really broken. People were waiting hours to get in. And all of a sudden he came down and he said, I want to help you. Let me do this for you. And for no fee, just help the county figure out their process. And man, you could get through in like 15 minutes. And the only reason it took 15 minutes is because you had to sit there for 10 minutes after you got your shot. So it was amazing, but it's a cultural thing, right? He was a leader. He led not just in the firm, but he led, or in his company, he led in the community. That's leadership, and that can go anywhere. So no matter who you are listening to this culture is something that everyone needs to work on, no matter what the company. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love that you used the Chick-fil-A example, because while accounting firms are not food service,
Right.
companies, it does make you think about how to influence culture over a large region, multiple offices, right? It would be crazy for us to say, well, if you and I were the CEO and president of, Chick-fil-A, to say, well, we're just going to let every location, we're just going to let them determine their own culture.
Yeah.
Well, that gets really squirrely there. And so your emphasis there, Sandra, on leadership driving this is really the big takeaway there. So thank you for that. All right. So we have a lot of listeners here, hopefully enjoying this conversation, thinking, all right, we probably need to apply some of these measurements to firm culture in our firm. What's your recommendation for when they end this podcast? What's your recommendation for their next step?
I would tell you the first recommendation is, if you do not do an upward evaluation, and you don't do a culture evaluation, then you should. You absolutely need to do that. Ask your people what they like and what they don't like. You can use SurveyMonkey. You can go out and find a net promoter that you can do for your firm. You can create your own. If you're interested, let me know. You can email me after we're done here, and you can send me an email and I'll send you some examples of what other people have done. Ask your people what they think, because they will tell you the truth. I will also say that sometimes if your trust quotient is not very high, you might have to have an outside company do that survey for you and gather the results and bring them to you. And the reason I say that is because it takes time to build that trust. If something has happened to break it, sometimes you have to have an outside company help you get started. You can carry the ball after that, right? But sometimes an outside company like Boomer, or some of you work with others, that's fine too. But I think that survey, that is the first thing that I would do to find out whether people are really thinking the way you think they're thinking.
Yep, absolutely. And there's a phrase we use here too. I think maybe we got it from Dan Sullivan as Strategic Coaches. All progress starts with the truth. And so that is one way to kind of get an assessment of the truth, are those upward evaluations. So Sandra, that concludes our conversation in this episode of the Boomer Briefing Podcast. Thank you so much for being on this episode. For the listeners out there, if you like these topics around talent, we also talk about topics around technology, process, growth, leadership. We are rotating every week. Please subscribe to this podcast, and we release new episodes every Tuesday morning. We have not missed a Tuesday morning for months and months and months. So just know that next episode is coming out Tuesday morning. Thank you so much. And thank you, Sandra.
Thank you so much. Everybody have a great day.